You have walked past them 1,000 times and never noticed. Every day, every interaction, every moment of your life. The truly powerful man in history was almost never the loudest. He was never the one demanding attention. He was never the one with the biggest army, the longest title, the most impressive credentials. In fact, if you study history, really study it, not the textbook version. If you read the actual letters, the diaries, the accounts written by people who were actually there living it, you discover something that contradicts everything you've been taught. The real power was somewhere else. It was with a man no one thought about. A man working in the shadows. A man whose influence shaped empires while he remained invisible to the very people he controlled. We celebrate the wrong people in history. We idolize the visible ones, the warriors who fought in public, the kings who sat on thrones, the orators who commanded crowds with speeches, the ones whose names everyone knows, the ones whose statues stand in town squares, the ones who wrote memoirs about their own greatness. But if you look closer, if you actually pay attention to who was moving the pieces while the visible ones were performing, you see a pattern. The visible ones were always vulnerable, always exposed, always one mistake away from collapse. Nicolo Machiavelli understood something that most people never will, even after reading his entire body of work. The visible signs of power are almost always signs of weakness. Think about that for a moment. A man who needs everyone to know how powerful he is still trying to convince them. He hasn't yet reached a key point where his power is so undeniable, so woven into the fabric of things, that he doesn't need to announce it. A man who has already convinced them, truly convinced them, doesn't need to say a single word. His presence is enough. His presence alone causes others to modify their behavior. The one who never had to fight for position because position was already assumed. This is the fundamental paradox that invisible power understands and visible power never grasps. The moment you announce your power, you're admitting it's not obvious enough yet. The moment you defend your position, you're revealing vulnerability. The moment you explain yourself, you're asking for permission to exist. Real power doesn't ask for permission. Real power moves without announcement. Real power simply is. So in this video, I'm going to show you why the most powerful men in history operated from shadows, how they accumulated power, shifted empires, shaped civilizations, while everyone else was watching someone else. Why invisibility isn't a weakness. It's the only power that actually lasts. And by the time you finish this, you're going to see invisible power everywhere, operating in your workplace, in your relationships, in the systems you thought you understood, and you won't be able to unsee it. We're going to look at Arthur Schopenhauer, who understood the psychological mechanics of why visible people are always vulnerable, Nicolo Machiavelli, who documented the strategy of invisible power throughout his writings, and one of the greatest military strategists to ever live. A man whose genius was so hidden that most of you have never heard his name. Here's what they taught you about success. More visibility equals more power. Be bold, speak up, make yourself known at every opportunity. Network, relentlessly. Build your personal brand. Influence everyone. Get noticed. Every book on success screams the same message. Every motivational speaker repeats it. Every algorithm rewards it. Get seen, get heard, get famous. But look at your actual life. Not the Instagram version, the real version. Who actually has power in your workplace? Usually not. Is it the woman who posts constantly on LinkedIn about her accomplishments, sharing every win, building her brand? Almost never. Who actually gets promoted? Who shapes the real decisions? Who actually moves, resources around? Who do people defer to without even realizing it? It's often someone in the background, quietly, invisibly. So invisible that most people don't even realize they're following them. You know this person. You probably work with them or know them personally. They don't seek attention. In fact, they seem to actively avoid it. They show up to meetings and listen more than they speak. When they do speak, people lean in. They don't broadcast their wins. They don't post about their success. They don't need you to know how smart they are because you somehow already know it. They don't need you to validate them. But somehow, when decisions get made, it's their direction everyone follows. When opportunities appear, the good ones, the ones no one else saw coming, it's people close to them who benefit. When organizations shift direction, you can trace it back to their influence. Yet if you ask most people who shape the change, they'll struggle to answer. Well, management decided. The board voted to... But they don't realize those decisions were already shaped before they reached the boardroom. And the strange thing is, most people attribute this to luck. Oh, she just got lucky. He was in the right place at the right time. He knows the right people. But that's not what happened. He made himself invisible. And invisibility is not an accident. It's not luck. Invisibility is a choice, a deliberate strategy, a calculated removal of yourself from the attention economy that consumes everyone else. Arthur Schopenhauer, one of the most misanthropic philosophers to ever write about human nature, observed something crucial about power dynamics. The moment you begin chasing visibility, you've already lost the game. Not because visibility itself is bad, but because the chase for it reveals something fundamental about you. Your hunger, your need, your desperation to be seen. And hungry people are always managed by people who are not hungry. A man who needs to be noticed can be controlled through that need. You dangle visibility in front of him, and he'll do whatever you ask. A man who doesn't care if he's noticed, a man who has genuinely surrendered the need for visibility, that man cannot be controlled at all. You have nothing to offer him. You have no leverage. The visible person is playing a game where everyone can see the moves. The invisible person is playing a completely different game on a completely different board. And you can't control what you can't see. Think about what happens in a chess match when one player can see the other's strategy clearly. That player can defend, can anticipate, can counter. But what happens when one player is playing 3D chess while the other thinks they're playing checkers? The game is already decided. The visible person thinks they're sheer winning because they're getting attention, praise, validation. The invisible person is actually winning because they're accumulating power. These are not the same thing. Attention is not power. Visibility is not dominance. Often they're the opposite. Attention is a liability in this equation. Attention drains energy. Power generates energy. Attention requires constant maintenance. Power compounds over time. Attention is temporary. Power is permanent. This is the fundamental inversion that invisible power understands, and visible power never grasps. Most successful people eventually learn this truth. The visible person thinks they're winning because they're getting attention, praise, validation. But they're exhausting themselves, maintaining the very visibility that's keeping them from real power. Let's ground this in something more than philosophy. There's actual research on this. Real psychological studies that most people have never heard of, because the findings are uncomfortable. Psychological research on status, signaling shows something interesting. When someone constantly signals their status through their words, their displays, their performances, their accumulated credentials, they're actually revealing something specific about themselves, not confidence. Deep, almost pathological insecurity. They're still trying to convince people of their value. A genuinely secure person, A person who is actually confident in their power doesn't need convincing. They don't need signaling. Their power is already understood, already felt, already assumed. They don't have to announce it. David Buss, an evolutionary psychologist, documented something fascinating in his research on dominance hierarchies. He studied primate groups, chimpanzees, gorillas, social structures across different species, and he found a consistent pattern. In every single primate group, the truly dominant individual, the one with the most actual power over resources, mating, territory, survival, is rarely the most aggressive. Usually it's not the biggest one, not the strongest fighter, not the one constantly displaying dominance. Usually it's the calmest one. The one whose presence alone causes others to modify their behavior. The one who never had to fight for position because position was already assumed. Why? Because dominance is about control, not about winning fights. This is the fundamental insight that separates real power from performance power. Real dominance is so complete that it doesn't need to be displayed. It operates at a level deeper than conscious awareness. People respond to it without even realizing they're responding. They defer without understanding why. Follow. Most people operate on what he calls fast thinking, emotional, instinctual, reactive, automatic. They respond to visible signals. Loud people, confident, speakers, attractive presentations, status displays. The brain has evolved to notice these things because they seem to matter for survival. If someone is loud and aggressive, they're a threat. Your brain notices. If someone is impressive and confident, they're high status. Your brain responds. But the truly intelligent person, the person with genuine power, operates on slow thinking, deliberate, calculated, strategic, 3 steps ahead. They're not trying to impress fast-thinking people in the moment. They're too busy thinking about outcomes. The invisible person has made a different calculation entirely. What matters is not whether you see them succeed. What matters is whether they actually succeed. Do they achieve their objective? Do they accumulate power? Do they shape outcomes? That's the only measurement that counts. There's research from the Harvard Business Review on powerful executives. They tracked CEOs and leaders across multiple decades. Hundreds of them. Different industries. Different eras. The ones who lasted the longest, who accumulated the most actual power, who built legacies that outlasted them. Almost never the charismatic ones. Not the ones known for dynamic leadership. Not the ones giving TED Talks or writing best-selling books about themselves. They were the ones most people would describe as quiet, private, almost shy. The ones whose personal life was mysterious. The ones who didn't need to tell everyone about their accomplishments. Yet their companies consistently outperformed. Their influence consistently grew. Their networks remained loyal, even through crises and scandals. Why? Because no one saw them coming. Nobody organized against them. Nobody felt threatened by them because their threat was invisible. Without knowing their following. Daniel Kahneman's work on fast and slow thinking explains why this works at the psychological level. Nobody was paying close enough attention to predict their moves before they made them. Here's where it gets dark. The most confident people, the ones with the most visible presence, usually overestimate their ability significantly. They think they're smarter than they are, more competent than they are, more powerful than they are. But the least confident, the quietest, the most genuinely competent people, they often seem almost invisible because they don't participate in the confidence display. They're not broadcasting their intelligence. They're not proving their worth through performance. The pattern is everywhere in history once you know to look for it. In 15th century Florence, during the height of the Renaissance, there was a banker named Cosimo de Medici. Most people have never heard of him. Most history books mention him in passing, if at all, but he was arguably the most powerful man in all of Europe for his time. More powerful than kings, more influential than popes. Yet he never held an official title. He was never a monarch, never a general, never even technically the ruler of Florence. Officially, Florence was a republic, a democratic system with elected officials, checks and balances. That was the appearance. The reality was completely different, but everyone understood the reality. Cosimo ran everything. How? By being invisible. Cosimo didn't display his power, he displayed his usefulness. He moved quietly through networks, built alliances not through force or violence or displays of strength, but by being useful, by solving problems, by making himself essential to other people's success. He lent money to families who needed capital. They became dependent on him. When key political moments came, those families made the decisions Cosimo suggested. Why? Because they owed him. Because he had positioned himself as essential to their future. He knew secrets. He had information. He had connections others needed. And he held all of this quietly, without announcement, without fanfare. When his rivals, the Albizzi family, tried to exile him, thinking they could eliminate his threat, they discovered something they hadn't anticipated. Cosimo had built so many connections, so many dependencies, that the exile lasted only months. By the time he could return to Florence, his network had destabilized the Albizzi completely. Not through direct conflict, not through armies, but through the quiet collapse of alliances that had been structured around debt, loyalty, and invisible obligation. Cosimo didn't raise an army. He didn't fight back visibly. He didn't make speeches denouncing his rivals. He simply waited. And while he waited, his network did the work for him. He ruled the Republic unofficially for the next 30 years. Generations of Florentine politics bore his fingerprints, and most people had no idea. Notice the contrast between visible and invisible. Cosimo's invisible power required none of that. It required nothing except patience. It required nothing except showing up and being useful. That's a completely different game. Cosimo's invisible power required none of that. It required nothing except patience. It required nothing except showing up and being useful. That's a completely different game. Cosimo had discovered something that most people never understand about power. Real power doesn't announce itself. Real power doesn't fight for recognition. Real power simply is. One of the clearest historical examples comes from ancient China. During the Three Kingdoms period, one of the most turbulent eras in Chinese history, there was a military Taoist strategist named Sima Yi. Arguably the greatest strategic mind of his entire era, a man whose military innovations shaped centuries of warfare, a man whose strategic vision was so advanced that his enemies could barely comprehend what he was doing. But he served under a paranoid ruling faction, and this is where invisibility becomes not just strategy, but survival. If Sima Yi had displayed his true power openly, if he had made obvious strategic moves, if he had positioned himself as a visible threat, he would have been executed, out of fear, out of jealousy, out of the paranoid understanding that a brilliant mind is always dangerous to mediocre power. So he did something brilliant. He made himself seem weak, faked illness, stumbled around looking feeble, confused basic facts in conversations, acted like a dying, incompetent old man. The faction relaxed. They stopped seeing him as a threat. They stopped perceiving him as someone who could challenge their authority. He became invisible because he appeared powerless. And while their guard was down, while they felt secure and unchallenged, Sima Yi and his allies orchestrated a complete coup. They took the entire empire, without a single visible battle, without a single dramatic confrontation. Sima Yi won because he made himself invisible. He weaponized the projection of weakness to consolidate actual power. The moment everyone stopped watching, the moment everyone assumed he was harmless, he moved. And by the time anyone realized what had happened, it was already finished. Nicolo Machiavelli himself understood this pattern deeply. His most famous book, The Prince, is usually read as a crude guide to visible power, manipulation, ruthlessness, overt force. People cite it when they want to justify ruthless behavior. But if you read it carefully, if you actually understand what Machiavelli was saying, you realize something most people miss. The successful princes in his examples, the ones who actually kept their power, who built lasting influence, they were almost never the most ruthless. They were the ones who understood invisibility, the ones who moved while others slept, made decisions without announcing them, built influence through the margins rather than the center, through whispered conversations rather than public declarations, through networks rather than armies. The visible princes, the ones everyone could see, the ones constantly displaying their power, those were the ones getting assassinated. Those were the ones being overthrown. Those were the ones whose empires collapsed within generations, because visible power is always vulnerable, always exposed, always one mistake, away from collapse. Machiavelli understood that power moves in darkness, that the real game is played in shadows, that the decisions that shape history are made in moments when nobody is watching. Do you see it now? Cosimo won through invisible networks, through making himself useful, through becoming essential without announcing it. Sima Yi won through invisible weakness, masking invisible strength, through projecting powerlessness to avoid threat. Machiavelli taught that visible power is always temporary, always fragile, always one mistake away from collapse. The pattern repeats across every era, every civilization, every major shift in power. And the moment you start seeing it, you realize you've been missing the real story your entire life. The truly dominant figures are almost never the visible ones. They're the ones you don't think about until it's too late. They're the ones that shaped history while history was busy celebrating someone else. So how do you become invisible? Not physically, strategically. This is where theory becomes practice. This is where understanding the pattern becomes actionable. The first and most fundamental mechanic is this. You must surrender your addiction to visibility. Not control it, not manage it, surrender it. Most people are addicted to visibility on a level they don't even understand. Somewhere deep in their psychology, they believe something crucial. If you're not noticed, you don't matter. If you're not seen, you might as well not exist. So they perform. They broadcast. They build personal brands for an audience that will never matter. They spend their entire lives trying to be noticed by people they'll never meet. The invisible person has made a completely different calculation. They've decided that what matters is not whether you see them succeed. What matters is whether they actually succeed. Do they achieve their objective? Do they accumulate power? Do they shape outcomes? Do they win? That's the only measurement that counts. And here's what's crucial. You cannot chase both. You cannot play for visibility and play for power. They're mutually exclusive games. The moment you start performing for an audience, you've compromised your ability to execute. The moment you're thinking about how you look, you're not thinking about how to actually win. When you walk into a room, do you fight for the center? Do you need to be in the middle of conversation? Do you need people to see you making moves, or do you control the exits? Do you position yourself to see everything? Do you understand the actual power, dynamics before anyone else? The visible person competes for attention. They're in the center. The invisible person has already positioned themselves to win, regardless of attention. That's the first shift. That's where it starts. When you stop caring about the center, you can finally see the edges. And power is always at the edges. This is the first mechanic of invisibility. Surrender the center. Control the exits. All real power operates from the margins. Not the center. Not the obvious place. The margins. The playhouse. says most people aren't looking. Think about how decisions actually get made in any system. The boardroom is where decisions are announced. The press release comes out. The memo is sent. Everyone sees the official decision. But that's not where the decision was made. The decision was made in the private conversation before the boardroom. The decision was made in the drinks with the CEO that nobody knew about. The decision was made in the subtle agreement between people who understand each other. The visible person fights in the boardroom. They're making arguments. They're trying to convince. They're performing. The invisible person already decided what the boardroom would discuss, already shaped what people would think was possible, already eliminated certain options before anyone even walked into that room. By the time the visible person thinks they're engaging, the invisible person has already won. Visible power says, "Look how strong I am." Invisible power says, "Let me solve this." One is about impression. One is about outcome. The invisible person builds power by making themselves essential, not impressively, not flashily, quietly, efficiently, reliably. They solve problems before those problems are articulated. They see needs that other people haven't noticed yet. They anticipate gaps in the system, and slowly, without fanfare, without announcing what they're doing, they become essential to how things actually work. The network doesn't function well without them. Opportunities don't appear without their input. Key decisions don't get made without their perspective. They've become essential without ever claiming it, without ever demanding recognition for it. And that's when they've won. Because essential people are impossible to remove. Essential people can't be threatened out of position. Essential people can't be replaced. Here's the final mechanic. The invisible person knows something about you that you don't know about them. Not maliciously, not necessarily. Strategically. You broadcast your thoughts. You share your plans. You announce your ambitions. You put your opinions out there for everyone to judge. They observe you while revealing almost nothing. They listen while you talk. They watch while you perform. This information asymmetry is power, because it means you're always at a disadvantage in any interaction. You're trying to convince them. They're trying to understand you. You're performing. They're observing. You're trying to impress. They're analyzing. Ask yourself right now, who do you actually know more about? The person who talks constantly, who shares everything, who broadcasts their life? Or the person who listens carefully, who reveals almost nothing, who keeps their own counsel? You probably feel like you know the talker better. You can predict them. You know their opinions. You know their struggles. But the listener knows you. Really knows you. Knows what motivates you. Knows your fears. Knows your ambitions. Knows how to move you. And that knowledge, that information, asymmetry, is power. You're trying to convince them using arguments, but they're understanding you at a level that makes arguments irrelevant. Who has the advantage in that exchange? This is the ultimate inversion of how most people think about power. Most people who learn this information do absolutely nothing with it. Why? Because it requires a fundamental shift in identity, not a shift in behavior, not a modification of tactics, a shift in how you see yourself. Your identity. Shiki is probably built on being visible, on being smart, being impressive, being noticed. Maybe on being the smartest person in the room. Maybe on people knowing how capable you are. Maybe on the validation that comes from external recognition. The invisible person has killed that identity. They've murdered the part of themselves that needs the world's recognition. And that's terrifying. Because if people don't recognize your brilliance, how do you know you're brilliant? If no one sees your success, does it matter? If you don't get the credit, does the accomplishment count? This is where the invisible person separates themselves from everyone else. They've developed an internal reference system. They know they're brilliant because they can see the outcomes, the power, the influence, the quiet accumulation of things that matter. They don't need external validation. They don't need anyone else to tell them they're winning. They can see it. What happens when you surrender the need to be seen? You become free. Actually, remarkably, shockingly free. You stop defending yourself because there's no one you're defending against. You stop explaining yourself because you're no longer trying to convince anyone. You stop winning arguments because you've realized arguments are how visible people prove themselves. You observe instead. You plan instead. You execute instead. And outcomes speak louder than any argument ever could. Outcomes are irrefutable. You can argue with my reasoning. You can disagree with my methods. But you cannot argue with results. Results are the language of invisible power. Over time, something happens. Something you didn't force. Something that grows organically. You're not trying to build a network. You're not networking. You're just being useful. You solve problems. You make connections others need. You see things before they're obvious. But slowly, something shifts. People realize they need you. People call you first. Opportunities come to you without you having to hunt for them. Your opinion is sought before decisions are made. Your presence becomes assumed in important moments. And you never once asked for any of this. You never once asked for any of this. You just made yourself too useful to ignore. The invisible person develops an extraordinary skill over time. They can read people and systems better than anyone. Better than the psychologists. Better than the analysts. Better than anyone. Why? Because while visible people are distracted by self-presentation, invisible people are reading. They're observing. They're understanding. They're seeing patterns others miss. They see the insecurities, the real motivations, the levers that move people. They understand status dynamics because they're not trapped in them. They see power moves others don't see because they're not busy making visible moves. They see the real fears, the real motivations, the real triggers, and that observation becomes their most valuable asset. Because once you can read people that accurately, you can move them, not through force, through understanding. You give them what they actually want, not what they say they want. You address their real fears, not their surface objections. You position yourself as essential before they even realize they need something. This is when the transformation is complete. You're no longer trying to have power. You have it. The difference is subtle, but absolute. Power see. Eking looks like desperation. It looks like effort. It looks like someone pushing. Power having looks like calm, like inevitability, like someone who doesn't need to convince you because you're already convinced. People sense the difference. They respond differently. And suddenly the world rearranges itself around you. Not because you demanded it, not because you performed for it, because you earned it invisibly. Because your power is woven so deeply into how things work that your presence has become essential. Because your power is woven so deeply into how things work that your presence has become essential. Here's what the invisible person knows that everyone else misses. Visibility is weakness, pretending to be strength. The moment you stop performing, the moment you stop needing the world to validate you, the moment you surrender the addiction to being seen, that's when you become truly dangerous. Not because you're attacking anyone, but because you're unreadable. You can't be predicted. You can't be manipulated. You can't be stopped because no one sees you coming. And that's the kind of power that actually lasts. That's the kind of power that shapes history. The men you remember from history, the ones with the famous names and the loud legacies. Most of them were pawns. Real power doesn't have a face. Real power doesn't have a Wikipedia page. Real power is the person no one thought about who changed everything. They were so invisible that you didn't see them coming. And by the time you realized what happened, they'd already shaped the outcome. Next episode, we're going deeper into something even darker. What happens when you become so invisible that you're not just observing the game, You're running it. What happens when your strategic position is so far ahead that people don't even realize they're playing a game you designed? What happens when your power becomes so complete that you operate from a place where other people's moves are already anticipated? That's the point where invisibility becomes mastery, where you're not just hidden, where you're untouchable. But first, understand this. Everything we discussed requires you to surrender something. Your need to be impressive, your need to be seen, your need to be recognized, your need for external validation. And most people aren't willing to make that trade. They'd rather win arguments and lose power. They'd rather be visible and remain stuck. They'd rather have the satisfaction of being right in the moment than the satisfaction of actually winning over time. If you're different, if you're willing to become invisible to become powerful, subscribe. Because what's coming next is what the truly dangerous have always known. You will never be impressive to the people who matter if you're trying to impress them. But you will reshape their world if you're solving their actual problems. Become invisible. Become useful. Become dangerous.